What would you do if 64 enemy aircraft suddenly appeared in the sky and you were the only one who could stop them? On December 13, 1943, a lone P-40 pilot faced overwhelming odds over India, outnumbered 64-1 with a failing engine and shot-up controls. What he did next defied every rule of fighter combat. This is the day one pilot rewrote the history of survival. Let's uncover what really happened. At 9:27 a.m. on December 13, 1943, the sky over Assam looked calm, too calm. A thin winter sun strained through the haze as Second Lieutenant Philip Adair pulled his Curtiss P-40N Warhawk into a climbing turn. Then the horizon shifted. 3 miles to the east, dark shapes bled through the mist. 64 Japanese aircraft locked in tight formation, driving straight toward Denjin Airfield. Adair was 23 years old with 43 combat missions behind him in the 89th Fighter Squadron, guarding the deadly Hump airlift over the Himalayas. He had seen engines burn and friends vanish into cloud banks. But this morning, he was the only Allied pilot in the air. For 8 weeks, Japanese raids had hammered airfields across northeast India, 47 transports destroyed on the ground, 112 personnel killed. Intelligence reports were blunt raids. This size striking undefended fields in Burma achieved 90% success rates. Below him sat Denjin, 14 C-47 transports loaded with critical supplies bound for Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China. A field hospital holding 63 wounded soldiers who couldn't run even if sirens wailed. Fuel reserves enough to sustain Hump operations for 11 days. If the bombers reached the field untouched, Allied supply lines over the Himalayas could collapse for weeks. Inside the cockpit of his P-40 Lulu Bell, number 44 Adair checked his gauges. Full internal tanks, 180 gallons. About 90 minutes of combat power, his firepower, 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns. Ammunition, roughly 12 seconds of sustained fire. Below him, the enemy formation moved at 240 miles per hour, 3,000 feet beneath his wings. 24 Mitsubishi Ki. 21 Sally bombers in disciplined rows, escorted by around 40 Nakajima Ki. 43 Oscar fighters layered above and below like a steel cage. Standard doctrine was clear: when outnumbered more than 5-1, wait for reinforcements. Adair faced 64-1. The nearest friendly fighters were 38 minutes away at Jorhat. By then, the bombs would already be falling. The C-47s would be burning. The hospital shredded. The fuel stocks erupting into towers of black smoke. He had a choice: shadow the formation, radio for help, survive, or attack alone and try to break their precision before they reach the target. Adair pushed the throttle forward. The Allison FOB 1710 engine roared manifold pressure, climbing to 54 inches. The Warhawk surged past 320 miles per hour as he climbed to position himself 4,000 feet above the bomber stream angling in from the south, with the sun blazing behind him. The Oscars hadn't seen him. Their focus was forward on Denjin. Japanese pilots expected fighters near the target, not 20 miles out, not diving from the sun. Surprise was his only ally. Adair tightened his grip and fixed his plan in place. Hit the lead bombers first. Ignore the fighters, shatter the formation, ruin their timing, force them to scatter. 12 seconds of fire against 64 enemy aircraft. In the thin Himalayan air, one question hovered. Could a single P-40 disrupt an armada? Can one lone P-40 tear into a formation of 64 Japanese aircraft and live to tell the story? Stay with this story to see how it unfolds. Subscribe for more untold combat stories. And now let's return to Adair as he tips his Warhawk into the dive. The lead Sally bombers flew in a tight, disciplined Block 6 aircraft arranged in two perfect V's of 3 silver wings, steady in the morning light. From above, they looked untouchable, precise, mechanical. Adair rolled, inverted. For a split second, the world flipped in his canopy. Then he pulled the nose down and dove from their 7 o'clock high. The Warhawk began to howl 320, 340, 360 miles per hour. The Allison engine screamed at full power as the range collapsed. The bomber crew still hadn't seen him. At 800 yards, he squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber Brownings erupted tracers, stitching into the lead Mitsubishi Ki-21's left wing. Fabric shredded, metal sparked. Then the port engine burst into orange flame, black smoke pouring backward. The tight V disintegrated. Bombers scattered left and right, discipline dissolving into chaos. Adair yanked back hard. 7 Gs crushed him into the seat, vision narrowing. He rolled right and saw 40 fighters diving toward him. The Nakajima Ki-43 Oscar was one of the most maneuverable fighters in the Pacific, light razor responsive, capable of turning inside almost any American aircraft. In the past 6 months, Oscars had shot down 63 Allied fighters over Burma and Northeast India. Adair's P-40N was faster in a straight line, its Allison Va-1710 engine delivering 1,240 horsepower and superior dive speed. But in a turning fight, the heavier Warhawk would bleed energy fast. Standard tactics were simple: never turn with an Oscar. Hit and run. Extend away. Reset. Adair couldn't extend. If he ran, the bombers would reform and Denjon would burn. The first 4 Oscars came from his 10 o'clock high. He rolled left, pulled up, and fired a 2-second burst. The tracers missed high. The lead fighter snapped right, its wingman glued to him. Adair reversed and dove building speed. 2 more Oscars dropped in from above. He hauled into a climbing left turn and fired again, no hits. His ammo counter showed 800 rounds remaining across all 6 guns. At this pace, maybe 6 more solid attacks. Behind the fighter screen, the Sally bombers were clawing back into formation, 3 groups of 6 tightening into shape. If they rebuilt their Vs, they would press the bombing run. Adair had perhaps 90 seconds before they reached release point over Denjon. He rolled out, rammed the throttle forward, and dove again straight at the bombers. 8 Oscars chased him down. The P-40 accelerated through 383, 195, 405 miles per hour. The lighter Japanese fighters couldn't match that dive speed. Adair opened the gap, pulled out at bomber altitude, and lined up on the right-hand formation, range 300 yards. He fired. Tracers converged on the lead bomber's right engine. The Mitsubishi Ha-101 radial exploded in a fireball. The aircraft rolled violently, trailing flame and debris. Its wingman broke hard to avoid collision, tearing another hole in the formation. Adair kicked, rudder-skidded left, and fired again at a second sally. His .50 caliber rounds punched clean through the thin fuselage skin. The Ki-21 had no armor for its crew, no self-sealing fuel tanks, only fuel metal, and men now flying straight into a storm of fire. Designed in 1936, The KY-21 was already considered outdated by 1943 standards, but it could still carry 2,200 pounds of bombs, more than enough to wipe Denjon airfield off the map. Obsolete didn't mean harmless. 12 Oscars were closing again. Inside the cockpit, Adair checked his gauges. 162 gallons of fuel, remaining 650 rounds of ammunition. The bombers were 19 miles from Denjon, 4 minutes, maybe less, before they reached drop range. Then another threat crept in. His engine temperature was climbing. The Allison 5171-0-81 was liquid-cooled, built to handle extreme heat at combat power for roughly 20 minutes. Adair had already been running at full throttle for 11. The coolant gauge read 230 degrees Fahrenheit. Normal was 210. At 250, failure began. He had 3 choices: throttle back and cool the engine brake off and return to base, or keep fighting and risk losing power over hostile territory. The bombers were 17 miles out, still lethal, still intact. He kept the throttle forward. 2 Oscars charged him head-on, closing speed over 600 miles per hour. Muzzle flashes flickered at 500 yards, 7.7 millimeter tracers, streaking toward his nose. Adair fired back. His heavier .50 caliber rounds reached farther and hit harder. At 350 yards, his tracers smashed into the left Oscar's engine cowling. The fighter shuddered and peeled away, trailing white coolant vapor. Adair rolled right and dove. The coolant temperature climbed to 240 degrees. The bombers were 15 miles from target. 2 formations of 6 had reformed into tight bombing Vs. The third group was still scattered. If those 2 formations held, they could still devastate Denjon. Adair dove again, slicing past 6, intercepting Oscars at 390 miles per hour. Too fast for them to follow in level pursuit. At bomber altitude, he leveled out and opened fire on the lead sally. His burst struck the right wing root. The structure failed instantly. The outer wing panel folded upward and tore free. The bomber rolled inverted into a spin. No parachutes followed. The formation shattered once more, bombers scattering in 3 directions. Even if they dropped now, their bombs would be spread across jungle instead of concentrated on the airfield. Adair pulled up hard. The coolant gauge read 248 degrees. The engine was running, rough vibration trembling through the control stick. Detonation had begun inside the cylinders, pre-ignition from extreme heat. If he didn't reduce power, the engine would seize. 8 Oscars dove out of the sun. He saw them late. He rolled left, but too slow. 7.7 millimeter rounds ripped through his right wing. Fabric tore, metal buckled. One round struck the right aileron control rod, turning the controls mushy. He had to force extra pressure just to keep level. Another burst climbed up his fuselage, sparks flashing across the engine cowling. Then a round punched through the coolant reservoir behind the firewall. Green coolant sprayed across his windscreen. The temperature needle surged past 260 degrees. Now he wasn't just fighting 40 enemy fighters, he was racing a dying engine. Before we find out whether Adair makes it home, tell us, where are you watching from right now? Are you tuning in from the United States, the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, or maybe India, the Philippines, Germany, or Brazil? Drop your country in the comments and let's see how far this story has traveled across the world. Steam burst violently from the seams of the cowling, curling back across the windscreen in ghostly white trails. The oil pressure needle didn't dip, It slammed to zero and stayed there. The Allison wasn't failing anymore. It was dying. Adair chopped the throttle, and RPM dropped from 3,000 to 2,400, the engine's vibration turning rough and uneven. It wasn't enough to hold altitude. The P-40 began sinking at 1,000 feet per minute, then 1,500. The altimeter unwound steadily, while above him the Oscars circled with cold patience, waiting for gravity to do their work. Then flames flickered along the nose. In a liquid-cooled engine fire follows a ruthless chain reaction. Overheated coolant vapor ignites, first slipstream drags the flames forward along the cowling, and if the fire reaches the fuel lines, running down the engine's left side, the aircraft explodes. Adair didn't need a manual to know that. He had perhaps 30 seconds before the Warhawk turned into a fireball. Procedure demanded shutdown and bailout. But he was at 8,000 feet, descending fast, 12 miles from friendly lines over dense jungle patrolled by Japanese forces. Capture would be inevitable. He kept the engine running. Pulling the mixture control back to idle cutoff for 3 seconds, he starved the engine of fuel. The flames shrank and sputtered. He pushed the mixture forward again. The Allison coughed violently, nearly quit, then caught running rough and angry. Power output dropped to about 60%. Not enough to climb, barely enough to stay level. He was committed to flying home on a burning engine. Behind him, the Sally bombers were 13 miles from Denjon, but their formations had collapsed. Individual aircraft were turning southeast toward Burma. The raid was broken. The airfield was safe. Adair turned southwest toward Naguli, 43 miles away, about 15 minutes of flight time if the engine survived. 6 Oscars followed at a distance. At 7,000 feet, oil pressure remained at 0. Inside the Allison metal ground against metal. Connecting rods hammered against a dry crankshaft. Vibration worsened, traveling up through the rudder pedals. The propeller arc wobbled slightly. Airspeed slipped to 180 miles per hour, edging closer to the 120 miles per hour stall speed. The Oscars closed to 400 yards, but didn't fire. They were waiting for the engine to seize. One fighter slid alongside close enough for Adair to see the pilot's goggles and scarf whipping in the wind. The Japanese pilot gestured downward, land surrender live. Adair stared straight ahead. At 6,000 feet, thick electrical smoke filled the cockpit. Earlier rounds had shredded wiring behind the instrument panel. The smoke burned his eyes and throat. He shoved the canopy open, letting the wind tear through the cockpit. Airspeed fell to 160 miles per hour. The Oscars drifted back, convinced he was finished. At 4,000 feet, the right aileron control cable snapped with a sharp, metallic crack. The aileron slammed to full deflection. The P-40 rolled violently right and dropped into a steep dive. Adair hauled back on the stick with both hands, nothing. The elevator cables were damaged too. He had almost no pitch control. The nose stayed down. Airspeed surged 200, 222, 150 miles per hour. The jungle rose rapidly in his windscreen as altitude fell through 3,000, 2,000, 500, and 2,000 feet. The engine roared unevenly, tearing itself apart, the airframe shuddering under strain. Above, the Oscars circled like spectators. The Warhawk was in a dead dive, controls crippled engine disintegrating. The ground was rushing up to meet him. Then, with the jungle rushing up beneath him, Adair had an idea. The damaged right aileron was forcing the wing down. The broken elevator cables had locked the stabilizer in a nose-down position. Gravity and airflow were dragging the P-40 into a fatal dive. But aerodynamics worked both ways. If he rolled inverted, the damaged aileron would force the right wing up instead of down. The stuck nose-down trim would push the tail down, lifting the nose. The very damage that was killing him upright might save him upside down. At 1,800 feet above the jungle, Adair rolled the Warhawk completely inverted. -1 G slammed him against his shoulder straps. Blood rushed to his head, his vision reddening at the edges. The fuel system built for positive G loads struggled to feed the engine while upside down. The Allison coughed, sputtered, nearly quit, then caught again, rough but running. The nose began to rise. The descent slowed. At 1,200 feet, the P-40 leveled out, inverted at 140 miles per hour. He held it there for 40 seconds. Airspeed increased to 160. He was climbing barely 50 feet per minute, but climbing. Then fuel starvation hit again. The engine faltered. He rolled upright. Instantly, the damaged controls forced the nose down, and the aircraft began descending at 600 feet per minute. He let it lose 300 feet, then rolled inverted again. The nose came up. He clawed back 200 feet before fuel starvation forced him upright once more. Flip climb, roll back, descend, flip again, climb. A desperate rhythm of survival. The 6 Oscars circling above watched in disbelief. A burning American fighter with shredded controls, flipping inverted and upright, refusing to crash. 1 Oscar dove closer. Adair saw him rolled inverted to gain altitude, then snapped upright and pointed straight at the Japanese fighter. The Oscar broke away. Whether the American was insane or simply unwilling to die didn't matter. The Japanese fighters turned east toward Burma. Adair continued his rolling climb toward Naguli. His fuel gauge read 83 gallons. Oil pressure had been at 0 for 9 minutes. By every mechanical law, the Allison should have seized. Instead, it kept turning, running on friction and whatever microscopic oil film remained. His altitude reached 3,000 feet, then 4,000. Naguli lay 21 miles southwest, about 11 minutes away. The coolant temperature gauge no longer worked. The needle had melted off. Smoke still streamed from the cowling, but the flames had faded. At 5,000 feet, he saw it, the runway, the tower, the revetments at Naguli. Safety. But a final problem waited. The landing gear was hydraulic, powered by the engine. His engine was barely alive and could fail at any moment. If he lowered the gear and the engine died, he would crash short of the runway. If he kept it up and attempted a belly landing, the impact could rupture his remaining fuel and ignite the aircraft. He needed the gear down and locked before the engine gave up for good. Before we bring him in for landing, let us ask you something personal. Did anyone in your family serve in World War II? A grandfather, great uncle, or relative whose story still lives on at your table? Share their country and branch in the comments and honor their legacy with us. He reached for the landing gear lever, and even that simple motion felt distant, delayed, as if his hand belonged to someone else. It trembled not from fear, but from carbon monoxide slowly poisoning his bloodstream. For 14 minutes, the cockpit had been filling with smoke, burned insulation, scorched oil, vaporized coolant. Each breath dulled. His thinking tightened his chest. He pulled the lever down. Nothing happened. The P-40's hydraulic system required 1,000 pounds per square inch of pressure generated by an engine-driven pump attached to the dying Allison. Under normal conditions, fluid would surge through steel lines and force the landing gear into position. But the engine was barely producing power. The pump couldn't build pressure. The gear indicators didn't move. The wheels stayed locked inside the wings. There was a backup, a manual hand pump mounted low on the left side of the cockpit. 28 full strokes would pressurize the system enough to lower the gear. It was meant for emergencies, but not like this. Adair grabbed it with his left hand while keeping his right on the control stick. 1, 2, 3. No resistance, no movement. The pump demanded both hands to generate real pressure. But if he let go of the stick, the damaged ailerons and weakened elevator would shove the nose down immediately. At this altitude, that would mean missing the runway entirely. He improvised. Reaching behind him, he loosened his lap belt and dragged it forward. He wrapped it tightly around the control stick, looped it through the seat frame, and pulled it tight. The crude restraint held the stick roughly neutral. It wasn't perfect, but it would keep the aircraft from pitching forward the instant he released it. He grabbed the pump with both hands and began working it hard. 5 strokes, 10, 15. His arms burned. His vision narrowed. Gray shadows crept along the edges as carbon monoxide continued its quiet assault. 20, 23. The handle began to push back pressure building inside the lines. 28. A heavy metallic thud echoed beneath the cockpit. The left main gear dropped and locked. 3 seconds later, another jolt. The right followed. Drag increased immediately. The P-40 felt heavier in the air. Airspeed bled from 160 to 135 miles per hour, barely above the 120 miles per hour stall speed. The crippled engine, producing perhaps 40% power, struggled to keep the aircraft level with the wheels hanging in the slipstream. Nagouli lay 7 miles ahead 3 minutes away. The temperature gauge read 310 degrees far beyond redline. Inside, the Allison pistons were expanding beyond tolerance bearings, running dry clearances disappearing. Failure was imminent. 5 miles out, ground crews at Nagouli spotted the smoke-trailing P-40 with gear down. From the ground, it looked like a routine emergency return. They expected flaps to lower speed to bleed off a smooth touchdown. But the flaps were hydraulic too, and there was no pressure left. He had used everything to lower the gear. The flaps remained up. Without them, landing speed would be 120 miles per hour instead of 90. That meant a long rollout. Nagouli's runway stretched 4,000 feet. A flapless landing in a damaged fighter required at least 3,000, possible if the engine kept running. At 2 miles from the runway, it didn't. The vibration changed tone. The engine coughed once violently, then quit. The propeller windmilled in the slipstream, slowed, and finally stopped. Silence filled the cockpit. The P-40 became a glider, an inefficient one. Under ideal conditions, its glide ratio was about 8:1. From 2,000 feet, that meant roughly 3 miles of glide. The runway was 2 miles away, possible in theory. But this aircraft was no longer ideal. Bullet holes scarred the wings and fuselage. Heat had warped panels. The extended landing gear created massive drag. Realistically, the glide ratio was closer to 6:1. The runway shimmered ahead in the haze, close enough to see clearly, far enough to remain uncertain. The jungle waited just short of it. After surviving 64 Japanese aircraft, after flying inverted for 11 minutes, after nursing a dying engine for 15, it seemed unthinkable that it would end 200 yards short of safety because the engine quit at the worst possible moment. Then, something from training surfaced in his mind. An instructor's brief comment about P-40 glide performance in inverted flight. In a normal glide, wings generate lift upward, while gravity pulls the aircraft down. Inverted, the aerodynamics reverse. At certain angles of attack, drag could actually be reduced. In theory, an inverted glide might stretch distance just enough to matter. No one ever expected a pilot to try it. Adair had nothing left to lose. At 1,800 feet, 1 mile from the runway, he rolled inverted again. Blood rushed to his head. His vision darkened at the edges. The jungle seemed to hang above him. Airspeed steadied at 125 miles per hour. Descent rate dropped to 500 feet per minute, better than the 700 he'd been losing upright. On the ground at Neguli Tower, operators stared in disbelief at an inverted P-40, approaching with landing gear extended and smoke trailing from the engine. Technical Sergeant Robert Martinez raised binoculars and saw the same thing. His first thought was that a Japanese pilot had captured a P-40 and was about to attack the field. He ran toward a .50 caliber gun position with 3 other ground crew and trained the weapon on the incoming fighter. Adair was at 400 feet, half a mile from the threshold, still inverted. Carbon monoxide and negative G-forces were shutting down his brain. He had perhaps 20 seconds of consciousness left. He had to roll upright, align with the runway and land, but not too soon. At 200 feet, 300 yards from the threshold, he rolled right side up. The damaged aileron forced the right wing down immediately. He fought it with left stick, straining to level the wings. The nose tried to drop. The broken elevator cables gave him only partial response. The P-40 descended steeply, nose-high wings wobbling. Martinez's gun crew tracked the aircraft. Smoke poured from it. In seconds, it would cross the runway threshold. Martinez had to choose fire or hold. He held fire. Adair crossed at 90 feet, descending too fast and too steep. The P-40 dropped the last 90 feet in 4 seconds. The main wheels hit the concrete with a 7G impact. The gear struts compressed fully. The tail wheel slammed down. The right main gear collapsed. The right wing dropped, the wingtip dug into the runway, and the aircraft ground looped right, spinning 180 degrees in a shower of sparks and concrete fragments before skidding backward 200 feet to a stop. Smoke poured from the shattered engine compartment. Adair sat motionless for 12 seconds, then unlatched his straps, climbed onto the wing, and nearly collapsed as ground crew rushed to support him. When they opened the cowling, the Allison was destroyed. Pistons seized, crankshaft, warped oil pan, ruptured coolant everywhere. 16 bullet holes marked the fuselage. 7, the right wing, 4 the left. 1 round had severed the right aileron cable. Another had punctured the hydraulic reservoir. A third had shredded electrical wiring behind the panel. The engine had suffered catastrophic overheating and oil starvation. 3 connecting rods were welded to the crankshaft. Lulu Bell would never fly again, but Philip Adair had broken the raid and saved Denjon Airfield. Intelligence reports confirmed what seemed impossible in the heat of battle. All 24 Sally bombers had turned back without dropping their ordnance. The Japanese formation scattered 15 miles short of Denjon. 40 Oscar fighters escorted empty bomb bays back toward Burma. 0 bombs struck Allied facilities. 0 casualties on the ground. 14 C-47 transports remained operational. The hump airlift continued without interruption. 1 pilot in 1 battered P-40 had stopped an entire raid. 3 days later, on December 16, 1943, 10th Air Force Headquarters interviewed Adair about the engagement. He calmly described the attack runs, the inverted flying technique, and the desperate landing. Flight surgeons examined him and found carbon monoxide levels in his blood still dangerously elevated 72 hours after the mission. Their conclusion was stark. For the final 11 minutes of that flight, he had been operating under severe poisoning levels that should have rendered him unconscious. Yet he had remained in control, flaunting through sheer will. On January 8, 1944, Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell, commander of U.S. forces in the China-Burma, India theater, awarded Second Lieutenant Philip Adair the Silver Star. The citation recognized his gallantry in attacking and disrupting a formation of 64 enemy aircraft while flying alone, continuing despite severe aircraft damage and personal injury, and preventing the destruction of critical supply facilities. It was an official acknowledgement of what those on the ground already knew. Denjan still stood because he refused to quit. Adair went on to fly 95 more combat missions with the 81st Fighter Group, the Burma Banshees. He achieved ace status with 5 confirmed victories, and on his final mission in July 1944, shot down 2 Ki-43 Oscars over northern Burma. He returned to the United States in September 1944, survived the war, and remained in the Air Force for 30 years, retiring as a full colonel in 1971. The 81st Fighter Group continued combat operations until August 1945, destroying 413 Japanese aircraft in aerial combat and 147 on the ground, while losing 63 pilots killed or missing. Their death's head skull insignia became one of the most recognized symbols in the China-Burma-India theater. The P-40 Warhawk never achieved the fame of the P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt. It was slower limited at high altitude and considered obsolete by 1943. But in the hands of pilots like Philip Adair, the rugged Curtiss fighter proved that in combat, specifications matter less than courage and skill. 1 pilot, 1 aging fighter, 64 enemy aircraft. December 13th, 1943. Proof that impossible odds mean nothing when someone refuses to quit. What would you do if your bomber exploded at 24,000 feet and you were trapped in the half that was falling? In the frozen skies over Nazi Germany, a 19-year-old tail gunner watched his B-17 torn in two by anti-aircraft fire. Bleeding alone, plunging 4 miles without a parachute, he didn't pray. He didn't scream. He kept firing at enemy fighters on the way down. Today we're taking you back into that sky to witness what happened next. At 11:32 a.m. on November 29, 1943, high above a burning Europe Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran knelt in the tail of a B-17 Flying Fortress named Ricky Tiki Tavi and watched German fighters rise toward him like a swarm of hornets. He was 19 years old, a dairy farm kid from Soldiers Grove, Wisconsin, on his very first combat mission over one of the most heavily defended targets in the Reich Bremen. That morning, more than 300 American bombers had crossed the North Sea. Within the first hour, 6 flying fortresses were already gone, swallowed by fire and smoke. The sky was turning into a cemetery. Moran occupied the loneliest position on the aircraft. 40 feet separated him from the rest of the crew. No reassuring voices, no quick glances exchanged. Just a narrow fuselage stretching forward and open sky behind him. He straddled a bicycle-style seat gripping twin .50 caliber machine guns, guarding the bomber's most vulnerable angle, the 6 o'clock position. German pilots had learned early in the war that an attack from directly behind a B-17 placed them in the firing arc of only one man, the tail gunner. Inside Ricky Tiki Tavi were 10 souls, pilot and co-pilot in the cockpit, navigator and bombardier in the nose, engineer in the top turret, radio operator behind the bomb bay, 2 waist gunners at open windows, a ball turret gunner suspended in a fragile glass sphere beneath the belly, and Moran alone in the tail waiting. By late 1943, the 8th Air Force was suffering catastrophic losses. 2 months earlier, the mission to Schweinfurt had cost 60 bombers in a single day, 600 men killed or captured in an afternoon. Crews had a grim nickname for deep strikes into Germany, milk runs to hell. The arithmetic of survival was merciless. Complete 25 missions and go home. The average crew survived 15. Some groups lost half their aircraft in a single month. Every takeoff felt like stepping into a statistical trap. Moran had enlisted the day he turned 18. He grew up milking cows before dawn, watching airplanes carve silver trails across Midwestern skies and imagining escape. The Army Air Forces needed young men with sharp reflexes and steady hands. Farm boys who knew how to shoot and didn't rattle easily. Gunnery school taught him to track fast-moving targets, calculate wind drift, compensate for altitude and airspeed fire in disciplined bursts to keep the barrels from overheating. He memorized the silhouettes of the Messerschmitt Bf-109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, able to identify them from 2,000 yards. But nothing in training could prepare him for 24,000 feet over Germany. At that altitude, the temperature plunged to 40 below zero. Frostbite claimed fingers and toes. Oxygen thinned until every movement felt like labor. And the fighters came in waves, firing 20-millimeter cannons that ripped through aluminum like paper. Ricky Tiki Tavi had lifted off that morning from Snetterton Heath, part of the 96th Bomb Group. The target: Bremen shipyards, aircraft factories, submarine pens, one of the most heavily fortified industrial cities in the Reich. The bombers flew in tight defensive combat boxes, overlapping fields of fire, meant to shield one another. The theory promised protection. The reality meant that when one bomber was hit, the explosion often damaged those flying beside it. As they approached Bremen, the sky erupted. Black bursts of flak blossomed around the formation. The bombers could not maneuver. They had to fly straight and level for the bomb run, steady and exposed. Shrapnel tore through wings and fuselages. Moran watched a B-17 ahead take a direct hit. For a split second, it seemed suspended in the air. Then it folded in half and fell away, taking its crew with it. Moments later, Ricky Tiki Tabi released 4,000 pounds of high explosives toward the factories below. Bombs away, mission accomplished. But over Germany, dropping the bombs was only half the story. The truly dangerous part was still ahead, the long-wounded flight home. Behind Moran, the German fighters regrouped, and they were coming straight for the tail. If you want to find out whether 19-year-old Eugene Moran survived the gauntlet over Bremen or became just another name lost in the frozen skies of 1943, take a second to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this incredible true story. The bomber formation had begun its long turn back toward England. 200 miles of hostile airspace still stretched between them and safety. Home was not a runway yet. It was only a direction on a compass. Then a burst of black flak exploded off Ricky Tiki Tabi's right side. The number 2 engine took a direct hit. The propeller windmilled, uselessly spinning without power. The aircraft shuddered and began losing speed, sagging in the sky. And everyone on board understood the unspoken rule of daylight bombing over Germany. A damaged B-17 that fell behind the formation was not unlucky, it was condemned. German fighter pilots hunted stragglers the way wolves hunted the wounded. Without the protective wall of overlapping guns, a lone fortress was easy prey. Now Ricky Tiki Tabi was drifting back, bleeding altitude marked. Moran saw them first. A dozen Messerschmitts climbing from low 6 o'clock. Focke-Wulfs diving from above, cutting off escape. They were boxing the bomber in. This time, there would be no shield of American firepower. This time, they would fight alone. And in the tail gunner's position, Eugene Moran would be the first target. The first fighter came straight from low 6, directly behind and beneath the bomber. Moran pressed his shoulders against the steel chest plate and squeezed the triggers. His twin .50 caliber roars. Tracer rounds streaked backward in burning lines. The German pilot grew large in his sights, then suddenly broke away. But there was no pause. More were coming. They attacked in pairs, 1 to distract, 1 to kill. A deadly rhythm perfected. Over years of war, Moran swung his guns from target to target, spent brass piled at his knees. The compartment filled with the sharp smell of cordite. At 24,000 feet, the temperature inside the bomber hovered at 43 below zero. He wore an electrically heated suit, but the cold still gnawed at him. His breath crystallized on his oxygen mask. The gun barrels grew hot from constant firing, while his fingers went numb inside his gloves. The Luftwaffe pilots were veterans. They knew the sequence cripple. The engines silenced the gunners, then pour 20mm cannon fire into the fuselage until something vital failed. Moran heard the impacts before he felt them, heavy thuds, then the violent tearing of aluminum. Cannon shells punched through the aircraft. Somewhere forward, one waist gun stopped firing, then the other. The intercom crackled with static and broken voices. No one could see the full picture. The bomber shuddered again. Moran kept firing. There was nothing else to do. A Focke-Wulf slashed in from 4 o'clock. He swung the guns, led the target squeezed. Tracers stitched across the fighter's wing. It disintegrated midair and spiraled downward, trailing black smoke. His first confirmed kill. There was no time to feel pride. Another impact slammed into him. Then another. Something tore through his left forearm, then his right. Both arms had been hit. Blood soaked through his sleeves. The pain was immediate and blinding. But his hands still worked. He could still pull the triggers. More shells ripped into the tail. The vertical stabilizer absorbed multiple hits. Control cables snapped and whipped violently through the compartment. The entire tail section vibrated with a deep, unnatural shudder. Something was terribly wrong. For the first time, Moran looked down at his parachute, the silk canopy folded tightly in a canvas pack strapped to his chest. His only chance if the bomber went down. He stared at it in disbelief. There were holes, multiple holes. Cannon rounds had shredded the silk. His parachute was useless. If he bailed out now, he wouldn't drift safely to Earth. He would fall 4 miles through frozen air straight into nothing. The attack did not stop. German fighters came in relentless waves circling the crippled Rikki Tikki-Tavi like predators that had already chosen their prey. Moran counted at least 15 of them slicing through the sky around the wounded bomber. The remaining engines strained and roared, trying to keep the aircraft airborne. But the fortress was bleeding altitude and speed with every passing second. In the shattered nose, navigator Jesse Orison was still alive, badly wounded, but conscious. Everyone else was gone. The pilot and co-pilot lay dead at the controls. The flight engineer was slumped in his turret. The radio operator was dead. The ball turret gunner was dead. The waist gunners were dead. 10 men had taken off from England that morning. Now only 2 were still breathing, Orison in the nose, Moran in the tail, 40 feet of torn fuselage separating them. Another cannon round struck, and this time it hit something critical. Moran felt the aircraft lurch violently. A deep grinding vibration shook the airframe, growing louder and more unstable. Then came a sound he would never forget, the shriek of tearing aluminum, the scream of structural failure. The fuselage split just forward of the tail. In one impossible suspended moment, Moran watched the front half of the bomber separate and fall away. The wings, the engines, the cockpit, the bodies of his crewmates all tumbling end over end toward the German countryside 4 miles below. And just like that, he was alone, trapped in a severed tail section, both arms wounded, parachute shredded 24,000 feet above enemy territory and falling. Physics offered no mercy. A human body reaches terminal velocity at around 120 miles per hour. The tail section of a B-17 weighed several thousand pounds. It would fall faster. Moran had perhaps 90 seconds left to live. The wreckage tumbled violently, spinning end over end and slamming him against the steel walls of the compartment. Pain ripped through his shattered arms. Blood sprayed across the interior. Wind screamed through the torn metal where the rest of the bomber had been. He should have been paralyzed with fear. He should have surrendered to the inevitable. Instead, he did something almost unthinkable. He kept fighting. The German fighters were still circling. They saw the tail section spiraling down and moved in closer, perhaps to confirm the kill, perhaps out of disbelief. They flew within range of a wounded tail gunner who refused to die. Moran grabbed his machine guns. The spinning made aiming nearly impossible. G-forces slammed him into his seat, then hurled him upward. His arms were broken. His parachute was useless. He was falling 4 miles towards certain death, and he was still pulling the triggers. Tracer rounds arced wildly across the sky as the tail rotated. The German pilot scattered, stunned by the sight of a man firing from a falling coffin. One Messerschmitt took hits across its fuselage and broke away, trailing smoke. Inside the tail, the altimeter was shattered, but through gaps in the torn aluminum, Moran could see the earth rising, fast fields, forests, roads rushing up to meet him. Then something unexpected happened. The vertical and horizontal stabilizers began catching air like crude wings, creating drag. Instead of plunging straight down, the wreckage started to glide. The spinning slowed. The descent steadied slightly. Not safe, not controlled, but different. Moran estimated he was dropping at roughly 100 feet per second, still fast enough to kill him, but slower than freefall. The damaged stabilizers were buying him seconds, maybe a minute, and he used every one of them to fire at any fighter that dared come close. 5,000 feet, 3,000, 1,000. The ground was no longer distant, it was inevitable. Moran braced himself against the steel chest plate and wrapped his broken arms around the ammunition boxes. There was nothing else to hold on to. The tail section slammed into the top of a pine tree at nearly 100 miles per hour. Thick branches snapped like matchsticks. The vertical stabilizer hooked a trunk and tore away. The wreckage cartwheeled through the forest canopy, shedding aluminum with each violent impact. His head smashed into the steel framework above him, and white light exploded across his vision. He felt ribs crack. His shattered arms bent at angles they were never meant to bend. The tail hit another tree, spun sideways, and finally crashed into the frozen ground. Then there was silence. Eugene Moran was still alive, barely. He lay twisted in the wreckage, unable to move. Both forearms were broken in multiple compound fractures, bone protruding through torn flesh. His ribs were shattered. Every breath stabbed like a blade. Blood poured from a head wound where part of his skull had been torn away, leaving a section of his brain exposed to the freezing German air. And yet, impossibly, his heart was still beating. Before we continue, take a second and tell us, where in the world are you watching from right now? Are you here in the United States, tuning in from Canada, the UK, Australia, or maybe from Germany, Vietnam, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your country and city. In the comment, we'd love to see how far this story is reaching. The crash site lay deep in a forest near Syke, 15 miles south of Bremen, enemy territory that had just burned under American bombs. Moran lay in the snow, surrounded by people who had watched their city explode. He tried to move. His legs responded weakly. His arms were shattered, useless. The cold was already creeping in. If blood loss didn't kill him, hypothermia would. Inch by inch, through blinding pain, he dragged himself toward the torn opening where the tail had ripped away. He had survived a 4-mile fall without a parachute, one of only 3 men in the entire war known to do so. But surviving the fall meant nothing if he died in a German forest. Voices echoed through the trees. German voices. Soldiers approached with rifles raised and surrounded the wreckage. They weren't looking at a miracle. They were looking at an enemy airman who had bombed their city hours earlier. Moran could not resist. He could barely breathe. They searched him roughly, ignoring his screams as they handled his broken arms. Dog tags, rank, a shredded parachute. Then they left him lying in the snow while they inspected the wreckage. An officer arrived and took one look at him. The American was dying. Transport seemed pointless, but orders were clear. Downed airmen were to be captured if possible. Dead men offered no intelligence. They loaded him onto a wooden farm cart, no stretcher, no blankets, and jolted him over frozen roads. Every bump sent shock waves through his shattered ribs and fractured arms. Blood from his skull wound had frozen into a dark crust. His world blurred into pain and cold. He was taken to a German military facility. He remembered being carried inside, laid on concrete, hearing voices discuss him as if he were already a corpse. No doctor came, no morphine, no water. Medical supplies were scarce, and they would not waste them on a dying enemy. For 2 days, he lay there. Infection spread. The exposed brain tissue swelled. His forearms darkened purple, then black gangrene setting in. Without surgery, he would lose both arms. Without antibiotics, he would lose his life. Guards watched him deteriorate, some indifferent, some almost sympathetic, none able to help. On the 3rd day, he was moved again. Another cart, another brutal ride. This time, he arrived at a prisoner of war hospital, a converted building where wounded Allied airmen were treated only if survival seemed possible. German doctors triaged ruthlessly. Those beyond saving were left to die. Moran was placed in that category. But inside that hospital were 2 Serbian military doctors, themselves prisoners captured on the Eastern Front. Forced into service working with crude tools and almost no anesthesia, they examined Moran. They saw what everyone else saw: a dying man. And then they made a decision no one had ordered. They would try to save him. Not because they had the equipment, not because they had permission, not because the odds were good, but because he was wounded and they were physicians. The surgery lasted 7 hours, 7 relentless hours, balanced between life and death. The Serbian doctors worked with field instruments never meant for injuries this catastrophic. There was no proper anesthesia, only local numbing agents that barely softened the pain. Moran drifted in and out of consciousness as they reset shattered bones with metal pins and wire cut away infected tissue and removed fragments of skull. They carefully covered the exposed portion of his brain with what tissue they could salvage, then secured a crude metal plate over the wound, primitive, but strong enough to keep him alive. His broken arms were splinted with wooden boards. Bandages were torn from bed sheets. They used everything they had, which was almost nothing. When it was over, they told him the truth. The next 72 hours would decide whether he lived or died. If the infection spread, he would die. If his brain swelled further, he would die. There was nothing more they could do. From that moment on, survival depended entirely on his body and his will. The fever struck that first night. His temperature climbed past 104 degrees. Violent chills shook him even as sweat soaked the sheets. The Serbian doctors changed his dressings and forced small amounts of water past his cracked lips. Antibiotics were nearly impossible to obtain in a German prisoner facility. Infection was the great killer of wartime hospitals, and bacteria had already entered his bloodstream. By the second night, Moran slipped into delirium. He called for his mother. He shouted warnings to crewmates who were already dead. His mind replayed the moment his bomber tore apart in the sky. Other wounded prisoners lay awake, listening, unsure if he would survive until morning. The doctors had no medicine left to offer, only cold cloths pressed to his forehead and whispered encouragement he likely never heard. On the third morning, the fever broke. The tremors eased. Moran opened his eyes and recognized his surroundings for the first time in days. The infection had not killed him. His body had done what medicine could not. The doctors saw early signs of healing. Tissue around the skull plate was beginning to close. The bones in his arms were slowly knitting together. Recovery would take months, perhaps years, but he was no longer dying. He was surviving. Word spread through the hospital. The American who fell 4 miles without a parachute. The tail gunner who kept firing as his bomber disintegrated. German guards came quietly to look at him. Allied prisoners asked to hear the story. Even the administrators regarded him with reluctant respect. But the hospital was only a temporary stop. Once he was stable, he would be transferred into the German prisoner of war system. 6 weeks after the crash, Moran could walk again. His arms remained in splints. The metal plate in his skull caused constant headaches. His ribs ached with every breath. But he was upright, conscious, alive. The Germans processed him with bureaucratic efficiency. Name, rank, serial number unit. They photographed him for their records. A thin 19-year-old with bandaged arms and hollow cheeks, staring into the camera with eyes that had seen too much and survived anyway. Before we move on, take a moment and tell us, did anyone in your family serve during World War II? A grandfather, great-grandmother, great-uncle, someone whose stories were passed down at the dinner table? Share their name, their country, and what branch they served in down in the comments. Let's honor their sacrifice together and make sure their legacy is never forgotten. His first permanent camp was Stalag Luft 4 in Pomerania, a prison built specifically for captured Allied airmen. Barbed wire fences, guard towers with machine guns, wooden barracks that did little to stop the brutal Eastern European winter. Thousands of American and British airmen filled the compound. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners shot down over Germany and occupied Europe. Some had already spent years behind the wire. Others, like Moran, had arrived only weeks earlier. All of them shared the same sentence: captivity, until the war ended, or until they didn't survive it. Behind the fences, a strange society took shape. The prisoners organized themselves into military-style units. They maintained discipline. They built libraries from donated books and held classes in math, history, even foreign languages. Secret radios were assembled piece by piece to monitor BBC broadcasts. Escape plans were drafted in whispers, though few ever succeeded. Food was scarce: thin soup, black bread, sometimes potatoes or turnips. Red Cross packages helped when they arrived, but deliveries were unpredictable. Most men lost 20 to 30 pounds. Some lost more. Moran's body continued to heal. His arms regained partial strength, though never what they had been. The headaches from his skull injury eased, but never disappeared. The nightmares never stopped. He was alive. He was surviving. But 17 months of captivity still lay ahead, and worse was coming. In the summer of 1944, the transfers began. Moran was packed into a cattle car with 60 other prisoners and transported across occupied Poland. There was no room to sit, no sanitation, no food for 3 days. Men collapsed against one another, praying for the train to stop. The destination was another camp, then another. Over the following months, he passed through 4 different facilities as Germany shuffled prisoners across its shrinking territory. Each transfer meant new guards, new disease, new hunger. Then came the worst ordeal, the Hell Ship. In the autumn of 1944, German authorities forced several hundred Allied prisoners onto an aging freighter crossing the Baltic Sea. The vessel had never been designed to carry human cargo. Guards herded the men into the hold below deck, a dark metal cavern with no ventilation, no light, almost no space to move. Moran descended with 200 others. The hatch slammed shut. The nightmare began. The darkness was absolute. Prisoners could not see their own hands. They heard only coughing, groaning, and men retching in the suffocating air. Those suffering from dysentery could barely reach the single bucket designated as a latrine. Within hours, the stench became overwhelming. The crossing lasted 4 days. Men died in that hold. Their bodies remained among the living because there was nowhere else to put them. Some prisoners went mad from the darkness and the constant rolling of the ship. They screamed. They prayed. Others simply went silent, and someone had to check for a pulse to know if they were still alive. When the hatch finally opened, gray daylight poured in like something unreal. Moran climbed out with eyes that had forgotten how to focus. His clothes were soaked with filth. He had lost more weight his body could not spare. The metal plate in his skull throbbed with relentless pain. The Hell Ship delivered its surviving cargo to yet another camp in Prussia. More barbed wire, more guard towers, more thin soup and black bread, more waiting. But the war was shifting. By January 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east while Allied armies pushed from the west. Germany was being crushed between 2 unstoppable fronts. The prisoners could hear distant artillery. They could see nervousness in the guards' faces. Something was about to change. On February 6, 1945, the change came. Soviet troops were approaching, and German commanders ordered an immediate evacuation. All prisoners would march west on foot, destination unknown, distance unknown. Refusal meant execution. The men assembled in the frozen compound as temperatures plunged to 20 below zero. Many had no winter coats, no gloves, no proper boots. They had survived for months on starvation rations, and now they were expected to cross Germany in one of the coldest winters in decades. The column stretched for miles, thousands of Allied airmen trudging through snow and ice, while armed guards marched beside them with rifles ready. Fall behind, and you were shot. Try to escape, and you were shot. The message was simple: walk or die. Moran had survived a 4-mile fall from the sky. Catastrophic injuries, crude surgery, raging infection, and the Hell Ship. Now he faced 600 miles of frozen roads in a body that had never fully healed. The march would later be known as the Black March, one of the longest forced marches of Allied prisoners in Europe. For 86 days, they walked through blizzards and freezing rain. They slept in barns thick with animal waste or on open ground. They drank melted snow and stole raw potatoes from frozen fields when they could. Disease spread quickly. An estimated 1,500 American and British airmen died from pneumonia, dysentery, typhus, frostbite that turned to gangrene, or bullets from guards who decided a straggler was not worth waiting for. The column left a trail of bodies across the German countryside like markers of suffering. Moran's body protested every step. His poorly healed arms throbbed in the cold. The metal plate in his skull conducted the freezing air straight into his head. His ribs burned with every breath. Men collapsed daily. Some never rose again. Others developed sudden fevers and were dead by morning. But Moran kept walking. He had not survived a 4-mile fall to die on a frozen road. The same stubborn determination that had kept him firing his machine guns as his bomber disintegrated now drove him forward one step at a time. By April, the prisoners could hear Allied artillery growing louder each day. American and British forces advanced from the west, while Soviet armies pushed from the east. Germany was collapsing. On April 26, 1945, near the Elbe River, the march ended. Soldiers from the U.S. 104th Infantry Division intercepted the column. The German guards dropped their weapons and surrendered. The prisoners stood in stunned silence, unable to process what was happening. After years of captivity and months of marching, they were free. Moran weighed 93 pounds. He had entered the army at 150. The crash, the camps, the hellship, and the march had stripped away nearly 40% of his body weight. He looked skeletal, but he was alive. Medical teams rushed to treat the liberated men. Typhus had spread through the column. Pneumonia was rampant. Frostbite had claimed fingers and toes that would require amputation. Doctors worked around the clock to stabilize men who had been starved and brutalized for months or years. And among them stood a former tail gunner who had fallen 4 miles from the sky and survived. He was awarded 2 Purple Hearts, 1 for each arm shattered by German cannon fire. He received the Air Medal with Oak Leaf Cluster, the European Theater Medal, and the Good Conduct Medal. On December 1, 1945, he was honorably discharged. The 96th Bomb Group had lost 938 men and 206 aircraft during the war. Moran's survival was a statistical anomaly in a unit defined by devastating losses. Even during the war, word of his fall had spread. Radio operators intercepted German broadcasts describing an American who fell 4 miles and lived. Back in Wisconsin, his family endured months of uncertainty. Anonymous letters hinted at hope, but official confirmation took time. When Staff Sergeant Eugene Moran finally returned to Soldiers Grove in late 1945, he was 21 years old, but he had aged decades. In 2007, the Wisconsin Board of Veterans Affairs created the Veteran Lifetime Achievement Award and chose Eugene Moran as its first recipient. At last, his state formally recognized what he had endured. A local teacher, John Armbruster, began documenting his story in detail, researching military records, and conducting interviews. The silence of 6 decades finally broke. The result was a book titled Tailspin, published in 2022, a full account of the boy who fell 4 miles and survived. In 2008, Soldiers Grove named a street in his honor, Eugene Moran Way. Eugene Moran died on March 23, 2014, at the age of 89. 70 years had passed since flak split his bomber in half. 70 years since he kept firing as the world spun around him. His guiding philosophy was simple: I would rather wear out than rust out. It was the creed of a man who refused to surrender to the enemy, to gravity, to infection, to hunger, or to silence. The tail gunner's position was the loneliest place on a B-17, separated from the crew, first target for enemy fighters, last to know if the bomber was going down. On November 29, 1943, Eugene Moran occupied that seat. And when his aircraft disintegrated around him, he did not wait for death. He kept shooting all the way down. What kind of fighter aircraft was so heavy that Japanese pilots laughed when they first heard about it? In 1943, many believed the American F-6F Hellcat was slow, bulky, and no match for the legendary Zero. But within just a few months, that mistake would dominate the skies of the Pacific and erase Japan's air superiority. The fighter they once mocked became the machine that swept the Zeros from the sky. Today we bring you a fascinating World War II aviation story that is sure to spark your curiosity. September 1st, 1943, Rabaul Airfield, New Britain. Inside a sweltering canvas operations tent, Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai studied an intelligence report. His hand paused as his one remaining eye scanned the page. The other had been taken by American gunners a year earlier. What he read made him laugh. "The Americans have built a new fighter," he said to the pilots nearby. "Heavy as a bomber, wide as a transport. They call it the Hellcat." According to the report, it weighed nearly twice as much as the Zero. The tent filled with laughter. Outside, rows of Mitsubishi A6M0s sat on sun-baked steel planking. Sleek, light, and deadly, they had ruled the Pacific sky for 2 years. British Hurricanes, American P-40s, and Dutch Brewster Buffaloes had all fallen before them. Every Challenger had been torn apart by the Zero's cannons before its pilot even understood the danger. To Sakai and his fellow aviators, the bulky new F-6F Hellcat sounded like just another American design failure, another easy target. What none of them knew was that within 30 days, this failure would begin the systematic destruction of Japanese naval aviation. The aircraft they mocked would rewrite the mathematics of air combat. The F-6F Hellcat would eventually achieve a staggering 19-to-1 kill ratio, destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft while losing only 270 in aerial combat. It would seize control of the Pacific skies and shatter the myth of the Zero. Japan's confidence in September 1943 was not arrogance, it was statistics. Since December 7, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service had achieved victory ratios that seemed unbelievable. At Pearl Harbor, they lost only 29 aircraft while destroying 347 American planes. In the Philippines, they lost 7 while shooting down 103. Over Darwin, just 2 Japanese aircraft were lost while 30 Allied planes were destroyed. The British and Dutch air forces in Southeast Asia had been crushed within days. At the center of this dominance flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, an aircraft that had rewritten the rules of fighter design. When American engineers finally captured intact Zeros in 1942 and tested them, the performance numbers seemed impossible. The range of a bomber, the maneuverability of a biplane, and the firepower to destroy almost anything it could catch. Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa later described the aircraft in his diary. "Flying the Zero felt like wearing wings." The aircraft responded almost to thought. American fighters, by comparison, felt like trucks, powerful but clumsy. The Zero achieved this performance through radical design choices. Its structure used a classified aluminum alloy called Extra Super Duralumin, making it roughly 30% lighter than comparable American fighters. But the weight savings came at a deadly cost. There was no armor protecting the pilot. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. Sometimes even the radio was removed to save weight. Every ounce was sacrificed for speed range and maneuverability. For 2 years, that gamble seemed brilliant. Against early Allied aircraft, the Zero was nearly untouchable. But hidden within its elegant design was a fatal weakness. The same choices that made the Zero legendary had also made it fragile. And soon over the vast Pacific, the heavy American fighter, the Japanese had dismissed the Hellcat, would expose that weakness and end the Zero's reign. Before the next chapter of this story unfolds, a question hangs in the air. What happens when the world's most feared fighter suddenly meets an enemy it cannot defeat? If you're curious to see how the Hellcat shattered the legend of the Zero, take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. The first reports of the F-6F Hellcat reached Japanese intelligence in early 1943 through neutral Swedish sources. The specifications sounded almost unbelievable. The aircraft reportedly weighed more than 12,000 pounds, fully loaded, over twice the weight of the Mitsubishi Zero, which weighed about 5,800 pounds. It carried armor plating, bulletproof glass, and self-sealing fuel tanks holding more than 250 gallons of fuel. Even more shocking, it packed 6 heavy machine guns with 2,400 rounds of ammunition. To Japanese engineers, it sounded less like a fighter and more like a flying tank. At Combined Fleet Headquarters, Captain Minoru Genda, the strategist behind Pearl Harbor, reviewed the data. His conclusion was dismissive. According to analysis preserved in Japanese defense archives, the Hellcat represented the same flawed American philosophy, trying to compensate for poor pilot skill with heavier machines. A Zero, he believed, would simply fly circles around it. On paper, the numbers seemed to support him. The Zero's wing loading of about 22 pounds per square foot gave it a turning radius near 600 feet, while the Hellcat's 36 pounds per square foot suggested a much wider turn of nearly 900 feet. Since Japanese fighter tactics relied on tight turning combat, the Hellcat appeared doomed. Reality arrived on September 30th, 1943, near Marcus Island. Petty Officer First Class Yoshio Fukui was escorting a reconnaissance plane when he spotted 6 dark blue aircraft climbing from the southeast. At first, he thought they were B-25 bombers on a strange heading. When they turned, he saw the massive fuselage and short wings of a new fighter. In his report, he wrote bluntly, "Americans have mounted fighter guns on a torpedo bomber." Fukui attacked using standard Zero tactics. He rolled into a diving turn, expecting the heavier aircraft to continue straight while he curved onto its tail. Instead, the Hellcat did something unexpected. It climbed straight up. Powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, producing around 2,000 horsepower, nearly 700 more than the Zero's engine. The Hellcat climbed rapidly. Fukui tried to follow, but quickly lost speed as the lighter Zero struggled against gravity. At around 15,000 feet, the Hellcat pivoted in a hammerhead turn, dropping directly behind him. The American opened fire. At 400 meters, Fukui later wrote, 6 machine guns, not the 4 we expected. My aircraft took 17 hits in 3 seconds. Only by forcing his Zero into a spin did he escape. He barely returned to Marcus Island with a damaged aircraft. His wingman and the reconnaissance plane never came back. First blood belonged to the Hellcat. Just days later, on October 5, 1943, another clash near Wake Island revealed the full danger. Lieutenant Yoshio Shiga led 12 Zeros from the 252nd Air Group to intercept 12 Hellcats. They held every advantage, altitude, position, and surprise. Victory seemed certain, Shiga later wrote. But when the attack began, the Hellcats refused to fight the traditional dogfight. Instead of turning, they stayed in formation and built speed in shallow dives. When the Zeros fired from long range, the Hellcats simply absorbed the damage. Their armor protected the pilot and vital systems, and their fuel tanks resisted fire. Then the American fighters counterattacked. Rather than turning, they climbed higher, where their engines still produced strong power. At 25,000 feet, the Hellcat could still generate around 1,650 horsepower, while the Zero struggled with barely 900. They came down on us like hawks on sparrows, Shiga wrote. They would dive fire those 6 terrible guns and climb away before we could react. When the fight ended, 8 Zeros had been shot down. Not a single Hellcat was lost. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese pilots faced an enemy fighter that could survive their guns, outrun their attacks, and control the battle. Within a year, American pilots would give the coming disaster a dark nickname: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. November 11, 1943, Rabaul. The pilots of the 204th Air Group gathered in silence as Lieutenant Commander Takeo Tanimizu, a veteran with 32 aerial victories, delivered a briefing few of them were prepared to hear. He was one of the rare pilots who had survived several encounters with the new American fighter, the F-6F Hellcat, and his warning cut through the room like cold steel. "Forget everything you know about air combat," he told them. "The Americans have changed the rules. They no longer fight our fight. They fight like executioners, not warriors." Tanimizu explained the harsh lesson Japanese pilots were learning across the Pacific. The Hellcat was not designed to outturn the Zero. It was designed so it never had to. American pilots used a doctrine called energy fighting, maintaining speed and altitude before diving in fast, powerful attacks and climbing away again. The Zero's legendary maneuverability meant nothing if the fight never slowed down long enough to use it. "They work in pairs," Tanimizu continued, "one high, one low. While you chase one, the other is already diving on you. Their radios, something we once mocked for adding weight, allow perfect coordination. We fight as individual samurai. They fight as a machine." By December 1943, the growing technological gap had become impossible to ignore. At Truk Lagoon, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike, inspected Zeros returning from clashes with Hellcats. The disparity in firepower alone was staggering. A Hellcat carried 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute combined. The Zero's lighter weapons delivered only a fraction of that destructive power, and the aircraft itself lacked armor and protected fuel tanks. In just a few seconds of concentrated fire, a Hellcat could rip a Zero apart. Even more disturbing were reports of radar-guided fighter direction. American ships could detect incoming aircraft from 50 miles away and guide Hellcat pilots directly to intercept them. Japanese pilots still relied mostly on eyesight. Lieutenant Sadamu Kamachi later described his first encounter with this system We were climbing through clouds when they hit us. No warning. Hellcats diving from above, perfectly positioned. They knew our altitude and our course. We were blind men fighting those who could see in the dark. At the same time, Japan's once elite pilot training system was collapsing. Before the war, naval pilots trained for 3 years and entered combat with around 700 flight hours. By early 1944, fuel shortages forced drastic cuts. New pilots arrived with barely 300 hours, many having trained in gliders because there was no fuel. Gunnery practice was limited to 50 rounds per pilot, and advanced skills like night flying or radio coordination were often skipped entirely. Meanwhile, American pilots arrived with hundreds of flight hours, thousands of practice rounds fired, and months of training in modern combat tactics. Training officer Yoshihiro Hashimoto summarized the crisis in one grim sentence: "We are sending children to fight professionals." One young pilot, he remembered, had never fired his guns in flight because there was no ammunition for practice. In his first combat mission, he survived 7 minutes. The full scale of the disaster became clear during the Battle of Formosa in October 1944. Japan committed more than 700 aircraft to stop massive American carrier raids and initially claimed a spectacular victory. But when combat reports were analyzed, the truth was devastating. Actual American losses were 89 aircraft. Japanese losses reached 329 aircraft, including many of the last experienced pilots. Veteran ace Sadaki Akamatsu, one of the few survivors, later described the battle with chilling clarity. Hellcats seemed to control every layer of the sky. When Japanese aircraft climbed, American fighters were already above them. When they dove, Hellcats waited below. The Americans had divided the sky into sectors, each controlled by a squadron. It was not combat, Akamatsu wrote. It was extermination. Within months, American pilots would give this one-sided slaughter a grim nickname that perfectly captured the reality of the Pacific Air War, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Before we continue the story, the narrator grows curious about the people watching this unfold across the world. Where are you watching from today? Drop your country and city in the comments so everyone can see how global this community really is. Are you watching from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, the Philippines, Vietnam, or somewhere else entirely? Let us know below, because it's always fascinating to see how stories from the skies of the Pacific bring viewers together from every corner of the world. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea. The Imperial Japanese Navy committed its rebuilt carrier force to Operation Ago, the decisive battle they believed would destroy American carrier power in the Pacific. 9 carriers with roughly 450 aircraft, many flown by Japan's best remaining pilots, advanced to meet Task Force 58, which fielded 15 carriers and 956 aircraft, including 450 F-6F Hellcats. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa launched his strikes in 4 waves, confident that Japanese pilot skill and the Zero's longer range would tilt the battle in his favor. The first wave of 69 aircraft launched at 8:30 a.m. American radar detected them from 150 miles away. Hellcats were immediately vectored to intercept with perfect positioning altitude, advantage the sun behind them approaching from Japanese blind spots. Lieutenant Zenji Abe, leading the escorting fighters, spotted them moments before combat. They were stacked from 20,000 to 30,000 feet, he later recalled. At least 60 of them waiting like a steel curtain. The Japanese formation was at 18,000 feet. Every advantage belonged to the Americans. The fight lasted 12 minutes. Out of 69 Japanese aircraft, 42 were shot down. Commander David McCampbell, commander of Air Group 15, shot down 7 aircraft that day. His wingman, Lieutenant Roy Rushing, destroyed 6. "The Zeros tried to turn with us," McCampbell reported afterward. "We simply refused. We'd dive shoot one down, then climb back up. They'd try to follow stall out, and another Hellcat would finish them." By the end of the day, Japan had lost 346 carrier aircraft and about 50 land-based planes. American losses totaled 30 aircraft from all causes. That night, American pilots jokingly gave the battle a nickname that would echo through history: the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. 4 months later, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 24, 1944, McCampbell would set another record. Leading just 7 Hellcats from the carrier USS Essex, he intercepted a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft heading toward the American fleet. In a 90-minute battle, McCampbell personally shot down 9 aircraft, 5 Zeros, and 4 bombers, while Roy Rushing destroyed 6 more. "I ran out of ammunition after the 9th kill," McCampbell later wrote. "The Hellcat performed flawlessly. My aircraft was never hit despite being outnumbered 8-1. The engagement showed how completely the balance of air power had shifted. 7 Hellcats had routed 60 Japanese aircraft, destroying 15 without losing a single plane." McCampbell's 2 ace-in-a-day achievements, 7 kills on June 19th and 9 on October 24th, earned him the Medal of Honor and the Navy Cross. But for Japan, the psychological impact was devastating. After the battles of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf, Japanese military analysts described a growing condition among surviving pilots: Hellcat psychosis. In his report, Admiral Ozawa wrote that American radar-guided fighter direction had achieved something Japan had never imagined: the industrialization of air combat. Each Hellcat, he concluded, was not simply a fighter, but part of a vast coordinated system. Japan's pilot crisis worsened rapidly. Before the war, naval pilots trained for 3 years and entered combat with hundreds of flight hours. By early 1945, the shortage was so severe that training was reduced to 40-50 hours for Navy pilots and 60-70 hours for Army pilots. Some kamikaze pilots received barely 40 to 50 hours total training, sometimes little more than a single week in the cockpit before being sent into combat. The skies that had once belonged to the Zero were now dominated by a new predator, the Hellcat. April to June 1945, Okinawa. Operation Iceberg became the final desperate struggle for control of the Pacific skies. Facing inevitable defeat, Japan unleashed a new weapon of desperation: mass kamikaze attacks. Nearly 1,900 suicide sorties were launched against the massive American fleet gathering off Okinawa. In response, the F4U-6F Hellcat evolved from a pure fighter into a shield for the fleet, intercepting waves of aircraft before they could reach their targets. Among the most effective pilots was Lieutenant Eugene Valencia, leader of a Hellcat unit known as the Flying Circus. During the Okinawa campaign, he personally shot down 23 Japanese aircraft. Valencia introduced aggressive group tactics that made traditional Japanese dogfighting nearly suicidal. One of his most famous methods was something his pilots called the mowing machine. 4 Hellcats would fly side by side in a tight line, each separated by about 100 yards, sweeping through Japanese formations at high speed. Every pilot covered a different sector. They would fire in a single devastating pass, climb back to altitude, regroup, and attack again. The numbers from Okinawa told the story of complete aerial dominance. Hellcats flew over 38,000 combat sorties, claiming 2,351 victories, while losing 249 aircraft, a kill ratio of roughly 9.5 to 1. Even more critical, they intercepted and destroyed roughly 80% of kamikaze aircraft before those planes could reach American ships. By 1945, the technological gap between the two sides had become impossible for Japan to close. The improved F6 F5 Hellcat was even more powerful than earlier versions. Water injection systems boosted the engine to about 2,200 horsepower. New rocket launchers added, firepower armor protection was strengthened, and the K-14 computing gun sight allowed pilots to calculate firing deflection automatically, something Japanese pilots could only estimate by instinct. Even legendary Japanese ace Saburo Sakai, one of the most skilled pilots of the war, experienced this new reality firsthand when he encountered Hellcats in June 1944. In his autobiography, he described performing every maneuver he had mastered in more than 200 combat missions, loops, rolls, split S-turns. Yet the Hellcat stayed with him effortlessly. The American fighter followed easily, almost casually, he wrote. Sakai survived only because the American pilot made a small mistake. He forgot to release his external fuel tank before engaging in combat. By the end of the war, the Hellcat's combat record had become legendary. The aircraft destroyed 5,223 enemy planes in aerial combat while losing 270 aircraft to enemy fighters, producing a staggering 19-to-1 kill ratio. Hellcat pilots produced 305 U.S. Navy aces and accounted for roughly 75% of all Navy air-to-air victories during the war. For Japan, the human cost was devastating. Of the roughly 18,000 naval aviators who had entered the war in 1941, fewer than 100 experienced combat pilots remained by August 1945. The once elite Japanese naval aviation force had been almost completely annihilated. In the end, the rise of the kamikaze strategy itself revealed how overwhelming American air superiority had become. Unable to compete in conventional air combat, Japan turned its remaining pilots into human-guided weapons. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, the architect of the kamikaze program, explained the logic with brutal clarity. If a Zero attacked an American carrier in a normal fight, the chances of success were nearly zero. The Hellcats would destroy it. But if that same aircraft became a flying bomb, diving directly into its target, the chance of striking a ship might rise to 30%. The pilot will die. Either way, Onishi reasoned. At least as a kamikaze, his death may have meaning. Before we continue, the narrator pauses for a moment with a question for everyone watching around the world. Did anyone in your family, perhaps a grandfather, great-grandfather, or even a grandmother serve during World War II? Maybe they flew aircraft, served on a ship, fought on the ground, worked as a mechanic, a nurse, or supported the war effort at home. If your family has a story from that time, share it in the comments. History becomes much more powerful when it connects to real families, so it would be fascinating to see how many viewers here have a personal link to the events of World War II. On October 25, 1944, legendary Japanese ace Hiroyoshi Nishizawa escorted the first official kamikaze mission led by Lieutenant Yukio Seki. During that escort, Nishizawa claimed his 86th and 87th aerial victories, reportedly shooting down 2 F-6F Hellcats. For a brief moment, Japan's greatest fighter pilot had defeated the aircraft that was dominating the Pacific skies. But fate turned quickly. The very next day, October 26, 1944, Nishizawa was traveling as a passenger aboard a transport aircraft when it was intercepted by Hellcats from VF-14. The transport was shot down. Japan's greatest ace, helpless, without a fighter, died at the hands of the aircraft he had briefly outmatched. Less than a year later, the war itself came to an end. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito broadcast Japan's surrender. At Atsugi Airfield, Captain Minoru Genda, the strategist behind the Pearl Harbor attack, and a man who had once dismissed the Hellcat as a heavy, clumsy design, listened to the Emperor's voice with the shattered remnants of Japanese naval aviation around him. The once elite Air Force had been reduced to teenage pilots, with barely 40 hours of flight training aircraft assembled from spare parts and almost no fuel. Ironically, the final aerial victory of World War II occurred that very same day. Lieutenant Clarence Moore of VM-31, flying an F-6F Hellcat from the carrier USS Belleau Wood, intercepted a Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bomber approaching the American fleet. The Japanese pilot apparently had not yet heard the surrender broadcast. Moore fired 2 short bursts from the Hellcat's 6 machine guns. The bomber plunged into the sea. With that brief encounter, the Pacific Air War ended. A few weeks later, in September 1945, the first American aircraft landed at Atsugi as part of the occupation. Leading them were 12 F-6F Hellcats from USS Yorktown. Japanese pilots and mechanics gathered along the runway to see the aircraft that had dominated them in combat. American Ace Lieutenant Robert Hanson, credited with 19 victories, demonstrated the Hellcat's performance. With casual ease, he performed loops rolls in steep climbs, maneuvers that would have torn a fragile Zero apart. Watching silently, the Japanese aviators realized how great the technological gap had become. After the war, Japanese engineers examined captured Hellcats and discovered the scale of American industrial superiority. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine contained thousands of precision machine parts built to identical specifications, so they could be replaced instantly. Japanese engines such as the Nakajima Sake required hand fitting. No two were exactly alike, making mass production far slower and maintenance more difficult. Even Jiro Horikoshi, the brilliant designer of the Mitsubishi Zero, studied the Hellcat carefully after the war. His conclusion was blunt and painful. Japan, he said, had designed an aircraft for 1941, focusing on maneuverability and elegance. The United States had built something entirely different, an industrial combat system designed for the future of warfare. While we were perfecting the sword, Horikoshi reflected, they were building the industrial age. That industrial power was visible in the Hellcat's production itself. At Grumman's Bethpage factory in New York, assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. At peak production, a new Hellcat rolled off the line every hour. In just 30 months, Grumman produced 12,275 aircraft a scale of manufacturing the Japanese war industry simply could not match. The fighter, once mocked as too heavy and too crude, had become one of the most decisive weapons of the Pacific War, proving that in modern warfare, industrial power could be as deadly as skill in the cockpit. By 1944, the scale of the war had become a contest of industry as much as skill. Japan produced about 5,100 fighter aircraft of all types that year. The United States produced 35,000 fighters in the same year alone. American factories operated around the clock. Workers assembled complex components using color-coded instructions, interchangeable parts, and strict quality control that allowed enormous speed without sacrificing reliability. To Japanese engineers whose aircraft often required careful hand-fitting, such a system seemed almost impossible. The F-6F Hellcat did more than win dogfights, it transformed naval warfare itself. Before the war, naval doctrine assumed aircraft carriers were fragile weapons that had to strike first or risk destruction. The Hellcat reversed that assumption. With hundreds of fighters constantly patrolling above the fleet carriers, became floating fortresses capable of absorbing and repelling almost any air attack. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, captured the new reality in a single sentence. With the Hellcat, we don't need to find them first. Let them come. Protected by what pilots called the Hellcat umbrella, American carrier groups could operate near enemy coastlines for weeks at a time. The conflict between the Zero and the Hellcat also reflected a deeper cultural clash. Japanese military traditions, shaped by the samurai code, emphasized individual skill, courage, and acceptance of death in battle. American doctrine emphasized coordination, technology, and survival. Hellcat pilots were trained to avoid combat when disadvantaged, regroup and attack again with superior speed and altitude. For many Japanese pilots trained under Bushido, refusing a fight even temporarily felt dishonorable. Even when they understood Hellcat tactics, their training made them difficult to adopt. After the war, veterans from both sides reflected on this difference. In 1962, the U.S. Navy held a symposium on Pacific aviation. Captain David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace with 34 victories, stated bluntly, "The Hellcat won the Pacific Air War. It destroyed Japanese aviation and made our victory inevitable." Japanese ace Saburo Sakai offered a striking reply. The Zero was a superior fighter. The Hellcat was a superior weapon system. We brought swords to a gunfight and wondered why we lost. The statistics behind the Hellcat told the same story. The aircraft achieved a 19-to-1 kill ratio overall, including roughly 13-to-1 against the Zero. In just 30 months, American factories produced 12,275 Hellcats. During roughly the same period, Japan produced only about 6,000 Zeros, and by August 1945, fewer than 100 experienced Japanese naval pilots remained combat-ready. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Japanese fleet during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, later admitted Japan had misunderstood what the Hellcat truly represented. It was not simply another aircraft, but the product of an entire industrial system. We laughed at the Hellcat, Ozawa reflected, because we did not realize it represented an entire civilization's approach to war. By the time we stopped laughing, our air forces had ceased to exist. The final word belonged to Saburo Sakai, who survived the war and lived until 2000. In one of his last interviews, he reflected on the aircraft that ended Japan's dominance in the air. The Zero, he said, had made Japan feel like a great naval power. The Hellcat forced Japan to realize it had been fighting the future with the weapons of the past. The F-6F Hellcat was heavier, stronger, better armed, and produced in numbers Japan could never match. Every extra pound Japanese pilots once mocked represented something deeper, the strength of an industrial nation that could afford to protect its pilots, build better machines, and replace losses faster than any opponent. The Japanese pilots had once laughed at the Hellcat. In the end, the Hellcat had the last laugh. What if the most dangerous American fighter pilot of World War II wasn't a battle-hardened veteran, but just a farm boy? From a quiet dairy farm in Wisconsin to the burning skies over the Pacific, this humble young man used precision, altitude, and perfect timing to shoot down 40 Japanese aircraft alone. Today we're revealing a true story that may forever change the way you see war. September 1944. High above the jungles of Borneo, the sky looked deceptively peaceful. Then Major Richard Ira Bong eased his P-38 Lightning into a shallow dive, twin Allison engines humming with 3,000 combined horsepower. Through his scratched bulletproof windscreen, he watched Japanese fighters claw upward toward a vulnerable formation of American B-24 Liberators. The bomber crews didn't know how close danger was. The Japanese pilots didn't know something worse than danger was already above them. Waiting in the high sun was the quiet farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, already one of the most lethal fighter pilots in American history. By that moment, Bong had destroyed dozens of enemy aircraft. He didn't fly with rage. He flew with calculation. Every movement was geometry and altitude, advantage, energy control, patience. When he pressed the trigger, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon mounted in the nose of his P-38 fired in a tight, devastating stream. No wasted rounds, no dramatic dogfighting flourishes, just precision. By war's end, he would score 40 confirmed aerial victories, becoming America's highest-scoring fighter ace, a record that 8 decades later still stands untouched. But the path to 40 victories didn't begin with heroism. It began with trouble. In California training fields, baking under the desert sun, instructors labeled him reckless. Unauthorized aerobatics, low passes over airfields, maneuvers that thrilled him but alarmed his superiors. More than once, his future in the Army Air Forces hung by a thread. Reports described him as immature, undisciplined, talented, yes, but unpredictable. No one saw a legend forming. They saw a liability. War has a way of refining raw instinct into sharpened discipline. When Bong reached the Pacific, he studied relentlessly. He memorized the strengths of the Japanese Zero, understood its turning ability, respected its climb rate. He learned not to dogfight recklessly, but to strike from above, fast and decisive. The once carefree trainee became patient, controlled, methodical. The P-38 Lightning became an extension of his instincts, long-ranged, heavily armed, perfectly suited to the vast Pacific skies. Now above Borneo, that transformation reached another crescendo. Bong rolled inverted and dropped out of the sun. In seconds, distance vanished. A burst of fire. One Zero erupted into flames. Another tried to break left too late. A short controlled squeeze of the trigger, and it spiraled downward, trailing smoke. The entire engagement lasted less than a minute. Below, the B-24 crews saw enemy fighters falling away, never fully grasping the silent choreography that had unfolded above them. 40 victories would eventually define his legacy, but numbers alone don't tell the story. The deadliest American fighter pilot of World War II had nearly been grounded before he ever saw combat. The same daring that once threatened his career became the instinct that kept him alive. From disciplinary problems in California to dominance over the Pacific, Bong's journey was not fueled by aggression, but by adaptation. In the thin air at 25,000 feet, discipline replaced recklessness, patience replaced impulse, and a quiet young man from northern Wisconsin became a legend written in smoke across the sky. Now the question lingers in the air: was Richard Bong truly born with the instincts of a legend? Or did the brutal skies of the Pacific shape him into America's deadliest ace? If this story pulled you into that cockpit and you could almost hear the twin engines roaring over Borneo, take a second to hit like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because the next chapter dives even deeper into the victories, the pressure, and the fate that awaited him after the war. Second Lieutenant Richard Bong had barely earned his wings at Luke Field, Arizona. His logbook was thin. His experience in the P-38 Lightning was limited. Yet before he ever faced the enemy, he nearly destroyed his own future. Over the California coast, a silver P-38 roared low across the San Francisco skyline in unauthorized aerobatic displays that blatantly violated Army Air Force's regulations. Civilians were impressed. His commanders were not. The reprimand was swift and severe. Careers had ended for less. The man forced to decide his fate was Major General George Kenney, commander of the 5th Air Force. Kenney valued discipline, especially in the unforgiving Pacific theater. He could have grounded Bong permanently. Instead, he studied him. Behind the recklessness, Kenney recognized something rare, extraordinary: aircraft control, instinctive, spatial awareness reflexes that operated with unnatural speed. Where others saw immaturity, Kenney saw a weapon still being forged. Bong was not dismissed. He was placed under scrutiny, given more training, and told without words that this was his last chance. By September 1942, Bong was assigned to the 9th Fighter Squadron, 49th Fighter Group, deploying to New Guinea. The odds were not in his favor. Japanese pilots had been fighting since 1937, veterans of brutal air campaigns over China and the Philippines. They were seasoned, confident, and highly skilled. December 1942, above Buna, New Guinea, Bong's first combat missions. P-38s climbed to intercept Japanese bombers escorted by Mitsubishi A-6M0's aircraft, famous for their agility. Many American pilots made the mistake of trying to outturn the Zero at low speeds. They rarely survived. But the P-38 was built for a different fight. Twin engines, twin booms, counter-rotating propellers, and a nose packed with 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon. No scattered wing fire, just a tight, devastating stream. With speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour and a ceiling above 40,000 feet, it could outclimb and outrun most opponents. The advantage was clear if used correctly. Bong learned quickly. He refused to dogfight. He climbed higher. He struck from above. Speed became his protection. Altitude became his leverage. When enemy aircraft drifted into the narrow convergence of his guns, he fired short, controlled bursts. The results were often immediate smoke flame and a spiraling descent into jungle below. His combat reports were cold and concise, altitude, angle, distance, outcome. No drama, no boasting, just efficiency. In those early battles over New Guinea, the reckless trainee disappeared. In his place emerged a disciplined tactician who understood the mathematics of survival. Don't turn, don't get slow, control the fight, fire precisely. Over the next 3 years, Richard Bong would refine that philosophy into a lethal system, one that would carry him to 40 confirmed victories and a place in American history. The P-38 Lightning was unlike anything in the sky. Conceived by Lockheed's visionary engineer Clarence Kelly Johnson, it looked futuristic and flew the same way. Twin booms stretched behind the cockpit. Twin Allison F4U-1 Engines roared in harmony. Counter-rotating propellers eliminated torque and delivered smooth, symmetrical thrust that stunned pilots accustomed to single-engine fighters. It was fast, powerful, and heavily armed, but it was also unforgiving. The turbo superchargers were temperamental. The handling felt different, almost deceptive, at the edge of its envelope. Most dangerously, in high-speed dives, the aircraft could encounter compressibility shock waves forming over the wings that locked the controls and sent pilots plunging helplessly toward the earth. Dozens died before the phenomenon was fully understood. The Lightning rewarded discipline and punished overconfidence. Richard Bong chose discipline. By early 1943, his tactical growth was unmistakable. Confirmed victories accumulated. Fellow pilots noticed something unusual. He wasted almost nothing. While others fired long, anxious bursts, Bong squeezed the trigger briefly and precisely. Gun camera footage revealed a pattern patient stalking from altitude, deliberate positioning, a short firing pass at close range, then immediate disengagement. No dramatic turning duels, no unnecessary risks. Major Thomas Lynch, his squadron mate and fellow ace, described his method as calm and exact. Bong would maneuver for as long as necessary to gain advantage, sometimes climbing or repositioning repeatedly before committing. Only when range angle and closure were perfectly aligned would he fire. His ammunition efficiency surpassed the average pilot by a noticeable margin. At the core of his success was deflection shooting, the ability to calculate where a moving aircraft would be when the bullets arrived, not where it appeared at the moment of firing. It demanded instinctive geometry at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Closure rates, angles, gravity, and lead all processed in fractions of a second. Most pilots struggled to master it under combat pressure. Bong seemed to feel it naturally. Subtle adjustments on the stick, gentle rudder correction, a slight bank to refine trajectory, then a tight burst from 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon mounted in the nose, creating a concentrated stream of fire that tore through enemy aircraft before evasive maneuvers could begin. The reckless trainee who once risked his career over California had transformed into a disciplined tactician in the skies over New Guinea. He understood the P-38's strengths, speed, altitude, firepower, and respected its limits, especially in dives where compressibility could turn advantage into catastrophe. That balance between aggression and restraint became his signature. And in the brutal arithmetic of aerial warfare, that balance separated those who vanished into the jungle below from the pilot whose name would soon echo across the Pacific. Before we continue this journey through the skies of the Pacific, take a moment and tell us, where are you watching from right now? Are you tuning in from the United States, Vietnam, the Philippines, Australia, Canada, or somewhere else across the world? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far this story of Richard Bong has traveled. 4th of July, 1943. Above Lae, New Guinea, heat shimmered even at altitude. Japanese bombers pushed south in tight formation, escorted by agile Zero fighters, weaving protective patterns around them. On the ground, Allied troops braced for impact. In the air, American P-38s clawed for height. Richard Bong climbed higher than most, resisting the instinct to dive too soon. He studied the geometry unfolding below the spacing between bombers, the rhythm of the escort pattern, the momentary gaps that appeared and vanished in seconds. Combat to him had become timing. He waited. Then he tipped forward and converted altitude into velocity. The P-38 plunged like a thrown spear. The dive built speed rapidly, whined screaming across the canopy. Before the escorting Zeros could adjust, Bong was already inside firing range. His nose-mounted guns fired in a tight stream. No convergent spread, no wasted arcs, just concentrated destruction. A Mitsubishi bomber shuddered as rounds tore through engines and fuselage. Flames burst from a wing root. It fell away, trailing smoke into the jungle below. Bong did not turn to celebrate. He did not slow down to duel. He pulled sharply upward, converting speed back into altitude. The maneuver was clean disciplined. Zeros tried to climb after him, but lost energy in the pursuit. They excelled in tight, low-speed turning fights. Bong refused to give them one. Dive, strike, climb, reset. The pattern repeated with mechanical efficiency. Multiple kills in a single sortie became less an accident and more a system. His ammunition expenditure per victory remained strikingly low. While some pilots emptied belts in hopeful bursts, Bong fired short, measured squeezes, often less than 2 seconds. Gun camera footage later showed the same pattern again and again: careful approach, minimal correction, precise lead, brief, trigger press, breakaway. Japanese intelligence began noticing. After-action reports described American fighters attacking from altitude, disengaging before counterattack could form. Some reports mentioned a distinctive P-38 marked Marge along its nose, named for Marjorie Vattendahl back home in Wisconsin. To Allied mechanics, it was a sentimental touch. To Japanese pilots, it became an identifier, the aircraft that seemed to appear out of the sun and vanish just as quickly. By November 1943, Bong's confirmed victories reached 21. He was no longer just another squadron pilot. Major General George Kenney personally decorated him with the Distinguished Service Cross. Soon after, orders came sending him back to the United States for a war bond tour. Crowds gathered. Newspapers celebrated the modest Midwesterner who had outflown seasoned Japanese veterans. Flashbulbs popped. Speeches were made. Yet beneath the applause, Bong felt displaced. The war was still being fought. His squadron was still flying. He asked to return. By March 1944, he was back over New Guinea in the upgraded P-38J. The improvements mattered: more powerful engines, better high-altitude reliability, cockpit heating that reduced pilot fatigue, hydraulically boosted ailerons that improved control in high-speed dives, where earlier models had stiffened dangerously. The Lightning was evolving, and so was its most lethal pilot. Meanwhile, Japanese air strength was eroding. Years of attrition had drained veteran ranks. Replacement pilots often arrived with fewer training hours and limited gunnery practice. The contrast was stark. American pilots like Bong now possessed extensive combat experience, refined deflection shooting skills, and coordinated formation tactics built on shared survival lessons. The balance of power in the Pacific sky was shifting not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. And at the center of that shift flew a silver P-38 named Marge, climbing once more into the high sun, its pilot already calculating the next engagement before the enemy even realized the fight had begun. May the 5th, 1944, above Hollandia, New Guinea, the tempo of the air war intensified. American bombers pushed forward to neutralize Japanese airfields ahead of major ground operations, and intelligence warned of heavy fighter interception. Richard Bong now flew not simply as a leading ace, but as a flight leader entrusted with protecting vulnerable bomber formations. Before enemy aircraft even appeared, he positioned his flights with deliberate care, altitude, first spacing disciplined, energy preserved. He understood that the battle would be decided long before the first trigger was pulled. When Japanese fighters climbed to intercept, Bong resisted the urge to rush. He maintained altitude superiority whenever possible, forcing the enemy to fight uphill. Timing became everything. He waited for moments of vulnerability, gaps in escort coverage, isolated aircraft drifting slightly out of formation, then converted altitude into speed in controlled diving attacks. The P-38's concentrated nose armament delivered devastating firepower in short, precise bursts. Engagements frequently ended with favorable kill ratios, American bombers continuing toward their targets, while Japanese fighters spiraled downward in smoke. Even while directing defensive maneuvers for the formation, Bong continued adding to his personal victory count. His tactical philosophy had matured into a disciplined system: maintain energy advantage, strike fast, disengage cleanly, never accept a low-speed turning fight that neutralized American strengths. Head-on passes became one of his most dangerous tools. Closing speeds left only seconds to fire. Many pilots broke away early under pressure. Bong often held steady, a fraction longer, firing at the exact moment geometry aligned, then slicing past the enemy at combined speeds that blurred vision and tested nerve. When Japanese pilots attempted diving escapes, Bong pursued with calculated restraint. The P-38 could maintain high speeds in dives that pushed other aircraft towards structural limits. He understood compressibility and respected its boundaries, allowing him to press attacks others might abandon. His ammunition efficiency remained exceptional. His kills per sortie ratio and disciplined firing patterns consistently surpassed average performance. By June 1944, Bong's total reached 28 confirmed victories, surpassing the World War I record of 26 held by Eddie Rickenbacker and making him America's highest-scoring ace. The milestone carried national significance. Major General George Kenney, determined not to lose his most valuable pilot, restricted him from routine combat. Bong objected, eager to remain in the fight. Kenney eventually allowed him to continue flying, primarily as a flight leader on high-priority missions, with experienced pilots providing additional cover. The restrictions did little to slow him. High-priority missions often meant confronting the most capable enemy units remaining in the theater. Above Hollandia, Bong demonstrated not only individual lethality, but command presence, shaping engagements, safeguarding bombers, and extending a record that now placed him alone at the top of American aviation history. Before we continue, take a moment and tell us, did anyone in your family serve during World War II? Maybe a grandfather who flew in the Pacific, a great-uncle who fought in Europe, or a relative who worked on the home front building the planes and ships that kept the war machine moving. Share their story in the comments. Let's honor their legacy together. 6th of October 1944, above Balikpapan, Borneo, a strategic oil center critical to Japan's war machine. The sky turned into a furnace of engines and gunfire. American bombers moved in to strike the refineries, aiming to cripple the fuel supply, feeding Japanese naval and air operations. In response, Japanese fighters launched a large-scale counterattack, climbing hard to intercept. Richard Bong led his P-38 formation upward to meet them, positioning his flight with the sun at their backs and altitude in their favor. He waited until enemy fighters committed to the bombers below, then struck from above with calculated timing. The first diving passes were devastating. Multiple Japanese aircraft were destroyed in rapid succession before coordinated resistance could form. But by late 1944, Japanese pilots were adapting. Defensive reactions tightened. Counterattacks grew more organized and aggressive. In the middle of one fierce engagement, Bong's P-38 absorbed direct hits. Cannon rounds tore into the airframe. One engine began to fail, shuddering under damage. Warning indicators flickered inside the cockpit. Most pilots would have broken off immediately. Bong feathered the damaged propeller, activated onboard fire suppression, and stabilized the aircraft. The twin-engine design of the P-38 allowed it to remain airborne on a single engine, though, with degraded speed and climb performance. Even with reduced power, he stayed composed, maneuvered carefully, avoided turning fights, and executed another precise firing pass before disengaging. He returned to base flying a wounded machine. Ground crews counted multiple impact points across wings and fuselage, initially assessing the aircraft as heavily damaged. Repairs were eventually completed, and Bong would fly the restored fighter again, a testament to both engineering redundancy and the discipline that kept him alive. By December 1944, his confirmed victories reached 40, the highest total ever achieved by an American fighter pilot. The milestone carried symbolic weight across the United States. Major General George Kenney, acting under direction from Douglas MacArthur, made the decision to permanently remove Bong from further combat. He was too valuable as a symbol, as a morale figure, and as a training asset to risk losing in the final months of the war. With 40 victories recorded, the nation's top ace was grounded. For Richard Bong, the air war was finished, his record sealed in history. Bong's final combat mission was December 17, 1944, a patrol that resulted in no enemy contact. His final combat patrol ended without enemy contact, an almost quiet conclusion to years of violent sky battles. Soon after, he returned to the United States as America's highest-scoring fighter pilot, a Medal of Honor recipient, and a national hero. But statistics never told the full story. The true measure of Richard Bong's impact was not just the 40 aircraft he destroyed. It was the bomber crews who made it home because he intercepted their attackers. It was the ground troops who received air cover during critical offensives. It was the tactical discipline he refined: altitude advantage, positional attacks, energy management, that became standard doctrine for American fighter units across the Pacific. His gunnery methods were studied, analyzed, and incorporated into training manuals. New pilots watched his gun camera footage frame by frame. Army Air Force's analysts noted his exceptional hit percentage consistently higher than the average fighter pilot. While exact numbers varied across reports, his accuracy was repeatedly described as extraordinary. Japanese pilots interviewed after the war acknowledged facing American fighters who used altitude speed and concentrated firepower with devastating precision. Many found that discipline difficult to counter. The aircraft that carried him to legend, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, also earned its place in history. More than 10,000 were produced, serving in every theater of the war. In the Pacific, its twin-engine redundancy improved survivability over vast ocean distances. The tricycle landing gear enhanced ground handling. Turbo superchargers delivered strong, high-altitude performance. Most importantly, its nose-mounted battery, 4.50 caliber machine guns, and a 20mm cannon eliminated convergence issues and concentrated fire into a single destructive stream. In the hands of a pilot who mastered deflection, shooting engagement times could be measured in seconds. Yet behind the record stood a thoughtful young man. Letters to his fiancée, Marjorie "Marge" Vattendahl, revealed someone focused less on fame and more on responsibility, protecting bomber formations, supporting ground forces, and simply doing the job well enough to survive. Then came August 6, 1945, Burbank, California. At the Lockheed Air Terminal, Major Bong, recently married and now assigned as a test pilot, prepared for another transition. The war in the air had shifted from piston engines to jets. He was flying the revolutionary Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter, capable of speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour and powered by a turbojet producing roughly 4,000 pounds of thrust. It represented the future. The P-38 era was ending. Shortly after takeoff, disaster struck. A catastrophic fuel pump failure starved the engine. At low altitude, there was almost no margin for recovery. Bong attempted restart procedures. The engine did not respond. He tried to turn back toward the runway, but the aircraft was losing height rapidly. In the final seconds, he attempted to bail out, but there was insufficient altitude. The P-80 crashed. Major Richard Ira Bong was killed instantly at 24 years old. That same day, thousands of miles away, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The world entered the nuclear age. News of America's ace of aces dying in a jet accident struggled for attention beneath headlines announcing a new and terrifying era. 80 years later, his record of 40 confirmed victories remains unbroken, and in the age of missiles and beyond visual range combat, likely permanent. But numbers alone cannot capture his legacy. It lives in doctrine and training manuals, in the disciplined geometry of air combat he helped perfect, and in the quiet reminder that even legends are bound by gravity. Modern air combat no longer unfolds at arm's length. Today, radar locks, infrared signatures, and beyond visual range missiles decide battles long before opposing pilots ever glimpse each other. The swirling close-range duels of World War II, the split-second deflection shots, The roaring head-on passes, the desperate climbs back into the sun, belong to another era. In that vanished world, Richard Ira Bong carved out a record that may never be challenged. He did not begin as a flawless prodigy. Early in his career, he risked everything with undisciplined flying. Yet the same instincts that once worried his commanders became under pressure and experienced tools of mastery. He learned restraint. He learned patience. He learned that altitude was insurance, that speed was survival, and that precision mattered more than bravado. Bong did not chase glory. He built geometry in the sky. His deflection shooting became legendary among fellow pilots. While others fired long bursts in hope, Bong fired in certainty. Short, controlled squeezes timed to the exact fraction of a second when bullet trajectory and enemy flight path intersected. Army Air Force's analysts who reviewed his gun camera footage consistently noted his exceptional hit percentage. Though precise figures vary across historical reviews, his accuracy stood far above average fighter performance. Engagement times were often astonishingly brief. The result was efficiency. Minimal ammunition expended maximum destructive effect. But numbers alone fail to capture impact. The 40 aircraft he destroyed represent only part of the ledger. Behind those numbers were bomber crews who landed safely because interceptors never reached them. Ground forces that advanced under air cover he helped secure. Young pilots who studied his combat reports and absorbed his tactical discipline. His principles maintain energy advantage, attack from favorable position, disengage before vulnerability, were folded into training manuals and passed to the next generation of fighter pilots in the Pacific. The aircraft that carried him to legend, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, proved ideally suited to his mindset. Its twin-engine redundancy increased survivability over vast stretches of ocean. Turbo superchargers provided strong, high-altitude performance against many Japanese aircraft. The tricycle landing gear improved ground handling. Most decisive of all, the nose-mounted armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns, paired with a 20mm cannon, delivered concentrated fire without convergence complications. In the hands of a disciplined marksman, it was devastating. Visitors today at the Richard I Bong Veterans Historical Center can stand inches away from his Medal of Honor citation study, mission logs covering more than 200 combat sorties, and view tributes to the quiet young man behind the headlines. The exhibits reveal a thoughtful personality, reinforced by letters to Marjorie Marge Vattendahl, reflecting on duty rather than fame. He often wrote about protecting bomber formations, about doing his job well, about bringing men home. Major General George Kenney, who once reprimanded him, later described Bong as the most effective fighter pilot he observed in the Pacific. Kenney emphasized that Bong's success was not theatrical, it was methodical. He made lethal effectiveness appear effortless through disciplined repetition of sound tactical fundamentals. The battlefields where he earned his victories are now silent. Tropical growth covers former airstrips. The aluminum remains of downed fighters have long since corroded into the earth. Yet the record remains unchanged: 40 confirmed victories. 200 combat missions survived. No American pilot has surpassed that total in the 80 years since. In an age where aerial warfare is conducted beyond eyesight through radar screens and digital displays, Richard Ira Bong's legacy stands as a reminder of a different kind of combat. One fought face-to-face at closing speeds exceeding 600 miles per hour. Superior technique, consistent execution, precision over aggression. The numbers speak clearly. The record endures. And the farm boy from Wisconsin remains America's ace of aces. What would you do if 64 enemy aircraft suddenly appeared in the sky and you were the only one who could stop them? On December 13, 1943, a lone P-40 pilot faced overwhelming odds over India, outnumbered 64-1 with a failing engine and shot-up controls. What he did next